Welcome to the next lesson in the animal behavior course. Today we're going to be discussing very simple forms of learning and how animals might be learning to change their behavior within their environment. And so you'll see on this picture here, this is a picture of an aplysia, which is just basically this giant sea slug. And even though they have a very, very small brain composed of only 9 ganglion, they are still able to learn. And so we're going to discuss sort of the different types of learning that both this animal as well as other animals can undergo. To start us off, let's think about what it means to learn. At its core, learning is a relatively permanent change in an animal's capacity for behavior that results from experience. In other words, over time, behavior changes because of the experiences an individual has. This is important in animal behavior because it helps explain how animals adapt to their environments, whether that's a predator avoiding danger, a bird learning a new song, or even us learning to associate the smell of food with a good meal. Now, throughout this course, we're going to look at different forms of learning and how they shape animal behavior in the real world. Before we dive into learning, though, let's go over reflexes first. Reflexes are simple, involuntary responses to some kind of stimulus. One example is dust, which is a stimulus in our environment, right? So when dust makes you sneeze, you don't really have control over it. It just happens. Now, it's not a conscious thing that you have to think about. For example, we jump when we hear a loud noise that we weren't expecting. This is called a startle response. When we automatically attend to a novel stimuli, we may also exhibit something called like the orienting response, right? So if I hear something over here, I will immediately kind of turn and look at it. This is, once again, another reflex to something unfamiliar or unsuspected. And so you might also turn and look in the direction when you hear thunder. This would both be sort of a startle and an orienting response. So they can both kind of happen together, but they're both examples of reflexes. Other examples seen in animals and humans would be like the withdrawal reflex. So when you touch a hot surface, you're going to immediately pull your hand back. This is just an instinctual response that's involuntarily, and it's almost impossible to override. Another reflex is known as the suckling reflex, and so this is a reflex that's present in mammals. Newborn mammals, including humans, have sort of this ability to trigger a suckling response when the presence of a nipple or a object that's placed near the infant's mouth. And so this reflex allows infants to obtain nourishment through breastfeeding or bottle feeding without having to sort of learn it. And now I'm going to pause here for a second and have you think about whether you think that reflexes are learned behavior. So take a minute, maybe write down what your response would be, pause the video if you need to, and think about whether reflexes are a form of learning. So reflexes are actually not a form of learning. From a very young age, you can do them without having to do anything. It's an automatic response formed through certain nerve pathways. For example, the suckling reflex is present as soon as a mammal is born, so they can obtain nourishment immediately. They don't have to learn. They can automatically get that nourishment and that sustenance. Okay, now let's move on to the simplest forms of learning. There are two forms that sort of fall into this category, and they're kind of like opposites. The first is sensitization, and the second is habituation. One of the most famous animal behavior demonstrations of these types of learning were done with the aplysia, which is this large ocean sea slug that I talked about in the introductory slide. These creatures do have a brain, but it's very simple, and it's composed of only 9 ganglia that sort of act as a central control system. And so basically, there's a lot of there's a lot of things can happen in learning with this animal, but there's not really a lot of complex thought that's going on with these guys. However, we will see that even though an animal doesn't have much of a brain, they can still learn. Let's first look at habituation. This is when we or animals experience a reduced response to a stimulus with repeated presentations of that stimulus. So basically, we or the animal are getting used to the stimulus, and therefore we begin to ignore it because it's not really useful to attend to, right? We're all habituated. We wear clothes every day, and until I point it out to you, you don't really notice or feel them on you. You don't notice your tongue is sitting at the roof of your mouth while you're listening to this video, but now that I told you it was, you can feel it. It's not that you can't feel it normally, it's just that you've become habituated to the feeling, and thus your brain no longer pays attention to it. And so that is the first example and one of the most simple forms of learning. To demonstrate this in sea slugs, the experimenters took advantage of the sea slug's withdrawal behavior. They breathe out of a siphon, but when you touch that siphon, it actually retracts inward to sort of prevent anything from like getting inside and harming the slug. Experimenters found, though, that if you continue to touch the siphon over and over, then the response will become smaller and smaller. Eventually, the slug will completely ignore the touch and stop withdrawing altogether. This is an example of habituation. The response to a stimulus is reduced through experience. Now, I want to put the question back to you. Why might an animal do this? Why might habituation be beneficial? Think about that for a second. So the reason is there's a lot to pay attention to in one's environment. So if something is irrelevant, then it's beneficial to not spend resources trying to avoid it or to pay attention to it. You, for example, know that clothes are not harmful. You wear them every single day. So eventually your brain decides it's not going to pay attention to them anymore, and instead dedicate those resources to paying attention to other things in our environment. And so that's why habituation is beneficial. All right, so let's look at the sort of the opposite of habituation, and that is known as sensitization. This is when a response to a stimulus increases due to the repeated interactions and experience with that stimulus. And so basically the animal is becoming hyper aware of the stimulus and increasing its response. This happens all the time with animals and humans when they gain experience with, for example, a predator. Prey animals will become more sensitized to the presence of predators through repeated encounters or experiences that were close calls. For example, if you're wandering through the forest and you see a tiger run across the pathway, you're all of a sudden going to be very much more sensitized to predator-like stimulus because you might need to be aware of those predators in those environments. And so it basically can increase vigilance to potential threats, even though you haven't actually been directly attacked or harmed by the predator, you're going to become hyper aware. So to demonstrate this in sea slugs, the experimenters actually applied an unpleasant stimulus to the slugs. And so they basically shocked, just very minorly shocked the slugs at the same time that they touched the siphon to kind of cause that withdrawal behavior. Then over time, they were measuring the intensity of that withdrawal behavior. Now, at first, the slug would withdraw its siphon so that it avoided the shock. But then in the next round, when the shock was increased, the slug's withdrawal response was also increased. And so the more and more shock that was applied, the more enhanced the response was. And so the slug was basically doing this to protect itself from unpleasant and potentially harmful stimuli through the process of sensitization. So both of these processes involve the simplest form of learning, and they're thought to kind of be opposites, but they can very easily be mixed up. So let's review the differences. How can you know if you're going to become sensitized or habituated in any given situation? Well, they both actually share a very similar underlying process. The neuron pathways are really beyond the scope of this course, but they're all very related in how they happen. And so when you're in a situation, both sort of processes are happening in tandem, but depending on sort of the outcomes of the stimulus and what happens is how your body will then respond, whether it will be habituated or sensitized to that individual. So one main difference between sensitization and habituation is that habituation is stimulus specific. You could habituate to one kind of spicy food or maybe like a ghost pepper, right? But that doesn't mean you then become habituated to all spicy food or like habanero peppers, right? So it's very specific to ghost peppers and you being able to habituate to that flavor. Sensitization, on the other hand, is general. It generalizes to all other sort of related stimuli. If you think about sensitization and how it increases in behavior over time, this makes sense. We should all be hyper aware of not just the tiger that just ran across, but also all sort of tiger-like or predator-like stimulus that are in the forest. And so we generalize it to all of those kinds of stimuli and become very hyper aware of our environment because of that. And so I really do want to point out, though, that habituation is important for studying animals because animals do it, but also it's important as an important process that we can leverage as animal behavior researchers. And so if we're studying animals that are constantly reacting to us as humans, then we're not really going to get a good idea of how the animal naturally behaves, especially in the wild. like it's really important that the animals we study are not just constantly running away from us, because if they are scared of humans and they're not habituated humans, they will constantly run away, and then we can't get any data on them. But then two, we want them to be so habituated to field researchers, like you can kind of see me here in the field. This is from a field research trip when I was out in Argentina. They won't behave normally if they're not habituated to humans, and once again, they'll sort of kind of freak out or aggress on us, and that really also makes it difficult to study their behavior. And so it's really important not just to study habituation in animals, but to also leverage it in order to be able to study animal behavior in more ecologically relevant contexts. All right, so let's review real quick. We talked about reflexes. Now, reflexes do not require learning, but we then move sort of into the single stimulus learning, which is the most basic forms of learning, habituation and sensitization. And so now we're going to move on to one of the most widespread learning phenomenon studied in animals, and that is known as associative learning. There are two types of associative learning. First is classical conditioning, which is sometimes referred to as Pavlovian conditioning. And then we have operant conditioning, which is sometimes referred to as instrumental conditioning. Classical conditioning is the pairing of a neutral stimulus with a significant relevant stimulus like food. So we'll get more into examples of like that in just a minute. And then operant conditioning is the use of consequences like punishment or reinforcement to change the probability of behavior. One of the most famous experiments in animal behavior and psychology is Pavlov's study of dogs and classical conditioning. So Pavlov was actually a physiologist studying digestion in the early 1900s, but he noticed something unusual in his lab. His dogs didn't just salivate when food was placed in front of them, they also began to salivate when they saw the lab assistant who usually fed them, or maybe even heard certain sounds that were associated with feeding. And so this observation led Pavlov to design an experiment. And so here's how it worked. He presented the dogs with food, which naturally caused them to salivate. In this sort of classical conditioning framework, this is known as the unconditioned stimulus, because the presence of food automatically triggers salivation. And then salivation itself is the unconditioned response, the behavior that just naturally occurs when you see the unconditioned stimulus. So next, he introduced a neutral stimulus. In this case, he used a bell, right? And so at first, the bell didn't really produce a response. Just ringing the bell did not cause the dogs to salivate. But then, through pairing, when the bell was consistently paired with food, the dogs began to associate the bell with food. And so after several pairings, the bell alone, without the presence of food, caused the dogs to salivate. And so basically, the dogs were associating the bell with being fed. Now, in this new situation, the bell has become what is known as the conditioned stimulus, and salivation, which was originally the unconditioned response, is now the conditioned response. This experiment demonstrates that the basic principle of classical conditioning is that an organism can learn to connect previously neutral stimulus with biologically significant ones. And it also showed that behavior in general can be shaped by associations. And so here is an actual formal definition of classical condition. It is a type of learning where an organism associates a previously neutral stimulus with a stimulus that naturally elicits a response. And after repeated pairings, that neutral stimulus alone can trigger the response. There are four key terms that are important for understanding classical conditioning. First is the unconditioned stimulus, and this is the stimulus that naturally elicits a response. In the case of the dogs, it's food. Then is the unconditioned response. This is the automatic, natural response that occurs in response to the natural unconditioned stimulus. Then you have the conditioned stimulus, which was originally neutral, but gains meaning through association. And then you have the conditioned response, which is the learned response to that conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response becomes the conditioned stimulus most of the time. And so those are often the same thing, but the conditioned response is the response that is elicited through the conditioned stimulus. So I'll go sort of over these definitions a little bit more because I know they can be a little bit confusing. So let's look at the dog example one more time. First, we present the dog with the unconditioned stimulus of food, which elicits the unconditioned response of salivation. Then we present a neutral stimulus, which is the bell, right? And that bell does not cause a conditioned response. However, through pairing and learning that when the bell comes and rings, so does food, we can sort of get this pairing of associations, which then ultimately results in the bell becoming a conditioned stimulus, resulting in a conditioned response of salivation. So you might think, wow, this is pretty simple, right? Maybe even think that, wow, animals can be tricked into salivating just at the tone of a bell. But the thing is, humans also fall for these very tricks. We are classically conditioned to so many different things in our lives. In fact, companies know this, and they've literally classically conditioned you every single day through advertisement. So for example, a catchy jingle or like a logo can give you happy feelings, which makes you feel good about a product. Similarly, when you smell food, that can make you hungry, even if you just ate. And that's sort of the idea behind why all restaurants involve sort of this red coloration, right? You start associating the color red with really good food. And so when you drive by a restaurant with these red signs, you might want to stop and grab a bite to eat. But there's also some more negative versions of this, right? So a phobia can develop through classical conditioning. So if you're bitten by a dog or a cat as a child, then maybe when you hear barking or meowing when you're an adult, you might sort of feel anxious. And so that's also classically conditioned. And then, of course, the one that we've all probably experienced maybe at some point in our lives is when you have a certain song that's associated with a certain relationship, that can sort of evoke strong emotions, either positive or negative, when you hear that song again later in your life. So these are all examples of humans being classically conditioned in everyday life. All right, so here is an example question that you might see on some sort of an exam, or if you just need to be able to understand this for understanding animal behavior. So here is the question. At an aquarium, trainers blow a whistle right before feeding beluga whales a bucket of fish. Now, at first, the whales only sort of salivate and become excited when they see the fish. But after a few weeks, the whales begin to get excited and salivate as soon as they hear the whistle, even if no fish is presented. And so I ask you, what is the unconditioned response and what is the unconditioned stimulus? And then also, what is the conditioned response and what is the conditioned stimulus? And so go ahead and take a pause if you want to sort of jot down the potential answers. But basically, the answer to this question would be that the unconditioned response is sort of this excited salivation response, and the unconditioned stimulus is fish. And so fish is causing this natural, excited salivation response. But then the conditioned stimulus becomes the whistle, right? So originally the whistle was neutral, but after repeated pairings, it becomes the conditioned stimulus, which then elicits the conditioned response of an excited sort of salivation response. And so this is an example question, being able to identify what the UR, the US, the CR, and the CS are in a given scenario. Now, the other forms of associative learning are known as operant conditioning. And so this type of learning is all about how behaviors are influenced by their consequences. The idea is pretty straightforward. If a behavior is followed by something that's rewarding, like reinforcement, it's more likely to happen again. If a behavior is followed by something that's unpleasant, like punishment, it's less likely to happen again. And so this is a very, very powerful type of learning. And even though we don't realize it, many of our behaviors that we do every day are the result of operant conditioning. Now, there are two different kind of subtypes of both reinforcement and punishment. So when we're talking about consequences, normally we think about consequences as sort of a bad term, but consequences just refer to what is the result of the behavior. So there are two types, each broken down into two subtypes. The first is a reinforcement. So when we're talking about reinforcement, this is anything that increases the likelihood of behavior. And then when we talk about punishment, punishment is the opposite. Punishment is anything that decreases the likelihood of a behavior. And so there's two different types of reinforcement, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Just when you're thinking about positive and negative, the only thing you need to be able to remember is that positive means something is being added, and negative is something is being removed, right? And so for positive reinforcement, you're adding something rewarding to increase behavior. Negative reinforcement is you're removing something aversive to increase behavior. Once again, you're increasing behavior either way, but it's whether you're removing or adding something that makes it positive or negative. This is often all the time confused in pop culture and in everyday life. Punishment, remember, the goal is to decrease behavior. And so positive punishment, this is the classic example that everyone thinks of for punishment. It's adding something aversive, right? Spanking a child is an example of positive punishment. Shocking a dog collar is an example of positive punishment. You're adding something to stop the behavior from happening. Negative punishment is when you remove something rewarding. This is often how parents will punish their children, right? They will take things away, give you time out, so that takes away your freedom, take away your car keys, take away your phone. You're removing something in order to decrease the negative behavior that the teenager or that the child was involved in. So these are sort of the different types, and we'll get sort of, I'll sort of go over everyday examples right now so you can kind of get some practice with that. So let's think about the positive examples first. Remember, positive means you're adding something to the environment of the subject, whether that's a person or an animal. So for example, if you study hard, you get good grades. This is positive reinforcement because if you add good grades, you're increasing studying behavior, right? You're more likely to study because you're receiving good grades. If you say similar with a bonus, right? If you get paid more money to work hard, right? That is positive reinforcement because somebody is adding money to your environment to increase your work behavior. Now, speeding and getting a ticket and how police operate is the example of positive punishment, right? Because if you get a speeding ticket, you're adding a fine, positive, you're adding a fine to decrease the bad speeding behavior, right? So positive punishment, you're adding something to decrease behavior. So these ones are usually pretty straightforward. This is often what people are referring to when they're talking about reinforcement or punishment. Now the flip, where you have negative, this one's a little bit more tricky and people sometimes get these a little bit confused. Remember, negative means something is being removed. So for example, negative reinforcement is quite tricky. But a common example of negative reinforcement is that pesky, annoying ding sound that happens in your car when you don't buckle your seatbelt, right? And so you buckle your seatbelt to stop hearing that noise, right? So you're removing the annoying noise and increasing that behavior, right? So you're increasing the behavior because you want to remove that annoying sound, right? So that is an example of negative. Something is being removed, something you don't like, something annoying or hurtful is being removed in order to increase the behavior of buckling your seat or doing whatever behavior you're trying to reinforce. And then I already kind of talked about the negative punishment. This one's a little bit more common, and this is when sort of like something gets a privilege or something rewarding gets taken away in order to decrease behavior. And so you remove a teenager's phone because you don't want them to not clean their room, right? So the behavior is not cleaning one's room. And so to decrease that behavior and actually increase cleaning, you would remove their phone, right? Their beloved, rewarding phone. So I do want to highlight, though, especially in that last example, that operant conditioning can be very, very complex. And so I'm going to give you a scenario real quick. And I want you to think about whether this is an example of positive or negative, is whether it's an example of punishment or reinforcement. So the example is when a child throws a tantrum in a grocery store, the parent then gives that child candy and the child then quiets down. So what is this an example of? If you're struggling with this one a little bit, think about what the behavior is and what is the consequence. So take a second to think about that real quick. So this one is quite a bit of a complex example because it really depends on whose perspective you're taking. If you take the parent's perspective, this is an example of negative reinforcement, right? The parent is trying to stop the behavior because it's annoying them. For example, if they're in public, maybe it's annoying or embarrassing. So they give candy to distract the child and reduce the stimulus of the tantrum, right? And so by giving candy, by giving the candy, that's the behavior that the parent's doing. They're giving candy, and as a result, the tantrum stops. And so that's an example of negative reinforcement. They're going to be more likely to give candy in the future because they found as a parent that giving candy stops tantrums. However, what the parent doesn't realize is that what they're actually doing is making tantrums more likely through positive reinforcement. Because if you take the child's perspective, the behavior of a tantrum is resulting in a consequence of candy that the child likes. And so this actually makes tantrums more likely rather than less likely to occur. And so this example highlights that when we're trying to determine if something is positive or negative, whether it's reinforcement or punishment, we really need to take the perspective of the subject, not the experimenter. So in this case, as a parent, we should be looking at it, the child's perspective, that they are performing a behavior, which is a tantrum, and we are giving them a consequence of candy. This is an adding a rewarding reinforcer, which is most likely to increase the tantrum behavior, right? And so that's actually positive reinforcement. And so we got to be really careful when we're looking at these scenarios to really look at it from the perspective of the child or the subject if we're researching animals. So now let's discuss operant conditioning in animal research. Here you see a rat that's inside what we call a Skinner box. And this is actually named after the famous researcher B.F. Skinner, who revolutionized the idea of operant conditioning. And we'll see a video sort of here in a minute, but how learning works in this case is that you put a rat into like a box, and the rat sort of just explores the box, right? You're not telling the rat what to do. You cannot communicate with the rat. But anyways, through its exploration, eventually it pushes a lever, right? And then that lever causes food to drop out, and the rat, you can see, is sticking its head into this little container to eat that food. And so that rat eats the food, and then it continues to sort of wander around, and maybe again, eventually it bumps into the lever. Food is dispensed, and then it does this a few more times, and eventually they learn that the rat will go over and just keep pressing the lever to get more and more food. So it learns this behavior of pressing the lever because it results in a positive consequence of food, right? And so because it has associated pressing the lever, it gets food, then that is operant conditioning. It is positively being reinforced to press the lever. And so this is the whole idea behind dog training, right? So if you've ever trained your dog, you can get a dog to do some crazy, wild tricks just by shaping it with positive reinforcement through giving it food rewards, right? If you want to get it to sit up like this dog, right, maybe you first reward the sitting. And then after you reward the sitting, maybe you start rewarding when it starts leaning back, right? And eventually you slowly shape the behavior through positive reinforcement to increase the likelihood of it doing this sort of sit up, paws in the air behavior, right? So this is sort of an example of how operant conditioning can be used as a dog trainer and training your own dogs, or even sort of a profession, right? Dog trainers are built on training dogs. And so I do want to highlight that there are more complex forms of learning. I'm sure that you all are aware of. As being human beings, there are other ways that we learn, and we'll go over those sort of different types of learning in different lessons in this course, but this has sort of laid the foundation for understanding how behavior can change in animals. And to be honest, a lot of behavior in animals and in humans can be explained simply by the consequence that a behavior induces when it occurs. And so there's still even debates today about the applicability of operant conditioning. Some people think that it explains literally all behavior, whereas when we sort of get into the idea of the cognitive revolution, we'll find out that that's not really necessarily the case, and there are examples of behaviors that do come to be or are increased or decreased not because of the reinforcers or the punishment that's involved. And so we'll get into those more examples later on in the course. But I do really like that video because at the time when Skinner came out with that idea in the 1900s, it was quite a revolutionary idea, and it really sort of made people question, well, wow, a lot of things in my environment and a lot of things that I do, including maybe my personality, are solely the result of a reinforcement and stuff. And so I really want to kind of bring this back full circle to how we can apply operant conditioning sort of through a discussion of like careers, and one career that a lot of people who are interested in working with animals pursue is sort of a zookeeper or a trainer at an aquarium, right? And so zoos and aquariums use operant conditioning every single day. And so basically animals can learn to voluntarily participate in veterinary procedures through the use of positive reinforcement and operant conditioning, right? So a treat can be given after a correct behavior is performed. For example, presenting a flipper or presenting a hand or like an arm for like a blood draw, right? And so they can slowly shape these behaviors over time so that the animal is less stressed around veterinary procedures and more willing to sort of participate voluntarily, right? And this is really important when you're working with wild animals that are living in a zoo setting, right? Because you can't just, like you can a child, you can't just kind of hold a child down and give them a shot. you need the animals to be able to approach and be able to willingly and voluntarily engage in these veterinary procedures. And operant conditioning is a way that zookeepers and aquarium trainers do that. All right, and so this wraps up this lesson here. The overview of today's course, this lesson was reflexes are not an example of learning. They're sort of these automatic responses. We also discussed sensitization versus habituation, the most basic forms of learning, as well as classical conditioning and operating conditioning.